Dawson Estate Auctions, Kelowna, British Columbia, a Thursday in November. Everett Strand stood near the back wall with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the lot at the far end of the display table. A typewriter case, cracked leather, one broken latch, a strip of water damage along the bottom edge. Two women from the Antique Dealer Association had walked past it twice without stopping. When he picked up his paddle and held it steady, the room turned. Then it laughed. The man 2 rows ahead of him, the one in the barber jacket who had come with a woman wearing a cashmere scarf, said something without lowering his voice. "What's he going to do with that? Use it for kindling?" The woman behind the auction podium looked at Everett. She didn't laugh. She brought the gavel down. Nobody in that room knew that 6 weeks later the same typewriter would sit on that same table, and nobody would be laughing. 3 days before the auction, Everett was at the kitchen table going through the week's mail when the Dawson catalog came through as a PDF attachment. He almost skipped it. He subscribed to 8 or 9 regional estate sale newsletters, mostly from BC and Alberta, and most weeks he scanned the thumbnail images and closed the window. But something made him open the attachment. He scrolled through lot by lot, mid-century furniture, a decent collection of Inuit prints, some framed maps, and he almost closed it again. Then he reached the last page. The photo was bad. Flash too close, background too bright, the case open at the wrong angle. But Everett set his coffee mug down and pulled the screen toward him and looked at the image for a long time. The paper carriage, the tension lever, the typeface wheel visible at the edge of the platen. He opened the photo in a separate tab and expanded it until the resolution broke down into blocks. There it was. He went to the filing cabinet in the hallway and pulled out a folder he hadn't opened in 2 years. Inside were printed spec sheets, photocopied correspondence, a partial serial registry he'd built himself from collector forums and museum archives. He sat with it under the kitchen light and compared what he remembered to what he was seeing on screen. The carriage return mechanism, the way the escapement was mounted. These weren't the decisions of a production line. These were the decisions of a single engineer working outside the standard assembly constraints, building a machine for someone specific, for a specific purpose. Everett had seen that configuration on 4 typewriters in his entire career, and all 4 had come out of the same design program. He called his neighbor Mrs. Osei and asked if she could take Petra to school Thursday morning. In the morning he drove Petra to the bus stop in the truck, with the crack across the right side of the windshield that he kept meaning to fix. Petra was in the passenger seat eating an apple and looking out the window at the gray November sky. "You're going somewhere today," she said. It wasn't a question. Auction house in Kelowna, going to look at a typewriter. She turned her head toward him slowly, the way she did when she was deciding whether to ask a follow-up question. She was 13, and she'd inherited his instinct for conserving words. "Is it a good one?" Everett thought about it. "I think it might be the best one I've ever seen." Petra considered this with the seriousness of someone who had grown up listening to her father talk about mechanical objects the way other fathers talked about hockey. She ate the last of her apple. "Then you should go," she said. She got out at the stop without looking back. The preview period at Dawson ran from 10 to noon. Everett arrived at 10 past 10 and moved through the room at a measured pace, looking at everything without stopping at anything. The hall held 22 lots, a credenza, several oil paintings of uncertain provenance, a set of wool blankets still in their original cedar chest, and at the far end of the central table, lot 19, the typewriter. He circled it once without touching it. Then he crouched, took a small flashlight from his jacket pocket, and worked the beam along the underside of the carriage housing. The serial number had been partially obscured, not deliberately, more as though someone had placed a label over it decades ago, and the adhesive had eaten into the finish, but the first 4 characters of the sequence were clear in the right light. He read them twice, then he stood up, clicked off the light, and rolled his shoulders back. The man in the barber jacket was behind him now, moving through the room with the deliberate ease of someone who had attended enough of these to know which lots mattered. He glanced at Everett, then at the typewriter, then at the man beside him, and something passed between them. Everett didn't turn around. At the podium, the auctioneer was reviewing her lot sheets. Her name was Quinn Latimer, and she had been running Dawson Estate auctions for 7 years, long enough to know which bidders were serious before the paddle ever went up. She almost missed it. The man crouched at lot 19 with a flashlight, unhurried, reading the underside of the case with the focused attention of someone who already knew what they were looking for. Almost. She made a note beside bidder registration 82. Then she went back to her sheet and wasn't entirely sure why she'd bothered. When lot 19 came up, the opening bid was set low enough to signal that Dawson's own staff hadn't known what they had. Quinn called for it once, then twice. Then a paddle went up near the back wall. Everett held it steady. The room turned. There was a pause, and then a sound that traveled from the front row backward. A laugh picked up and carried, and the man in the barber jacket said, clearly, "What's he going to do with that? Use it for kindling?" Quinn looked at Everett. He was looking at the typewriter. No other bids came in. She brought the gavel down. The room was already moving to lot 20. But when Everett came forward to sign the receipt, their eyes met for a moment. Hers were measuring. His gave nothing. She looked down and wrote his number in the column. Everett arranged transport and got the typewriter to his workshop the following morning. He ran the repair shop out of the lower level of a converted heritage house on Bernard Avenue in Kelowna that he'd been leasing for 5 years. The sign out front said Strand Mechanical Restoration in faded blue letters. He did clocks, cameras, the occasional instrument repair, and once in a while, when the right thing came through the door, a typewriter. He set the case on the workbench and stood looking at it for a moment. Then he went to his desk and pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in almost 3 years. It rang 5 times. Then, "Everett, you're still in Victoria. I'm still in Victoria." A pause. The sound of a chair. "What did you find?" His name was August Hale. He had spent 31 years as the senior conservator of mechanical objects at a national institution in Ottawa before retiring to Victoria to consult and, as he said, to finally read all the books he'd been meaning to read since 1987. He and Everett had worked together exactly once, on a machine that had turned out to be significant in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. They had stayed in each other's orbit since. "I want to describe something to you," Everett said, "and I want you to tell me if I'm reading it wrong." He described the carriage return mechanism, the escapement, the typeface configuration and the way the tension lever was mounted. He described the first 4 characters of the serial number. August was quiet for a long time. "Where did you get it?" he said finally. "Regional estate auction in Kelowna. Lot 19. I paid $420. Another silence. "Say that number again." Everett said it again. "You need to be very careful," August said. "If you're right about what you're describing, you need documentation before you tell a single person what you think this is." "I know. Do you have the Whitmore registry?" "I have a partial. I've been building it off forums and the Byrne Museum archive. I have the full registry. Or what I believe is the full registry." A long pause. "I'll drive up." He arrived 2 days later in a mud-brown Subaru with a cardboard box in the back and the quiet, unhurried manner of a man who had stopped being in a hurry about 30 years ago. He came into the workshop, set the box on the workbench beside the typewriter, and looked at it without speaking for almost 2 minutes. Then he said quietly, "Where did you find the serial reference?" "Under the carriage housing. Left side." August crouched. He didn't use a flashlight. He looked for a long time. Then he stood up slowly and put both hands flat on the workbench. "There were 7 of them," he said, "built between 1953 and 1956, under a private commission from the Canadian Typographic Design Consortium, prototype program for a limited production professional series that was never publicly manufactured. The program was dissolved in 1961 when the lead engineer died. After that, the 7 machines were supposed to be held in institutional collections." He paused. 3 are confirmed. 2 are missing. 1 was destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1974. He looked at Everett. "This would be the 7th. What does that mean, in terms of documented? With clean chain of title and independent authentication, you're looking at somewhere between $200,000 and $280,000 at the right auction." He said it plainly, the way you say something when you want the number to land without performance. "I know what you paid." August opened the cardboard box and set the registry on the workbench. It was a binder, thick, hand-assembled over decades, photographs and photocopies, and handwritten notes in a precise, cramped script. He opened it to the last tabbed section. Everett read the entry. Then he read it again. He put his hand flat on the workbench beside the typewriter, Not dramatically, just a hand on wood, and stood there for a moment. There was something in it that wasn't pride and wasn't quite relief. It was closer to the feeling of being right about something you'd staked more than you probably should have on, and finding out the stake was good. He had 6 weeks before the Dawson catalog cycle closed, and relisting became possible. He counted back from the date on his phone. 6 weeks if he didn't sleep much. That afternoon, Quinn ran the standard follow-up process on the lot. Dawson liked to track condition and disposition data on specialty items. It informed their assessment model and helped with comparable pricing on future catalogs. She called the number on the bidder file and got through to the workshop. She explained the policy in her professional tone, the one she'd developed over 7 years of talking to buyers who ranged from retired dentists filling their garages to serious collectors who could price an object to within 5% on site. She said she tried to do a check-in on specialty lots within the first 2 weeks. She made it sound like something she did for every buyer. It was not something she did for every buyer. Everett said she was welcome to come by. She arrived the following Tuesday. The typewriter was already partially disassembled, the carriage removed, the housing open, the internal mechanisms laid out on a cloth, on the bench in a sequence that made clear someone had done this before and knew exactly what they were going to put back. Quinn looked at it without allowing her expression to change into anything useful. Everett walked her through what he was doing and what he was finding. He used specific language, mechanical language, the kind that comes from familiarity rather than performance, and she found herself tracking it more closely than she usually tracked the comments of buyers who were explaining their own purchases to her. "Are you planning to resell after restoration?" she asked. "I haven't decided." She wrote that down. It was the wrong answer for the question she'd asked, and precisely the right answer for the question she hadn't asked, and the gap between those two things stayed with her on the drive back to the office. She opened the bidder file when she got back. Strand E. Bernard Avenue. She ran the name through the regional business registry. Strand Mechanical Restoration, established 9 years ago. Before that, she found a conference paper from 2013. Everett Strand listed as a contributing researcher for a symposium on mechanical conservation held in Montreal, a citation in a collector's publication from 2015. A brief mention in a Victoria Museum newsletter about a clock collection that had been restored with assistance from independent conservator E. Strand. She closed the window. She did not close the browser. She made a note in the lot file. Buyer demonstrates specialist knowledge. Advise follow-up at week 3. She underlined follow-up twice and then sat looking at what she'd written. Word got back to the man in the barber jacket by the end of the 2nd week. His name was Philip Crest, and he ran an acquisition firm out of Vancouver that sourced rare objects for private collectors. He heard through the Dealer Association network. The way things always moved, circles. In these circles, someone had driven past the workshop on Bernard. Someone had mentioned it at a dinner. Someone had asked a question they weren't supposed to ask out loud. The mechanic with the junk typewriter was apparently doing something serious. Philip sent a man named Hartley. Hartley came into the workshop on a Wednesday morning with a business card from Crest Acquisitions and a rehearsed pitch about private buyers who valued discretion and speed. He said he was in a position to make an offer that would save Everett the time and uncertainty of another auction cycle. While he talked, his eyes kept going to the typewriter on the bench, now partially reassembled, covered with a cloth. Everett stood between Hartley and the workbench. "Not for sale," he said before Hartley had finished. Hartley tried the angle about fair market value. He tried the angle about avoiding Dawson's commission structure. He mentioned a number. "Not for sale," Everett said again. Hartley left. Everett watched his car turn off Bernard and disappear. That evening Philip called Quinn directly. He had her number from a benefit dinner 3 years ago, and he had remembered it without being asked to. He was cordial. The way people are when they've decided. The cordiality is a means to something. He asked whether she'd be able to share any details from the lot file, provenance notes, any documentation the seller had disclosed at time of sale. Quinn said that information was internal to Dawson's process, and she wasn't in a position to share it. Philip mentioned that Crest Acquisitions had placed close to $300,000 through Dawson's catalog over the past 2 years. Quinn said she'd heard him, and that she'd answered his question. She ended the call. She sat at her desk for several minutes after that. She had not told Everett about Philip's inquiry. She wasn't sure whether she should. She wasn't sure what she'd say if she called. She pulled up the workshop number in her contacts and stared at it. Then she added a note to the file. External interest. Disclosure to buyer recommended. She didn't make the call that night. On the afternoon of week 3, she drove to the workshop on Bernard without a clipboard. She parked on the street and went in and told him she'd been passing by. He looked at her. Then he looked out the window at Bernard Avenue, which ran straight for 4 blocks before ending at a chain-link fence at the edge of a commercial yard. Then he looked at her again. He didn't say anything. He opened the door wider. The typewriter was further along now. The carriage back in place, the housing partially closed, several of the exterior panels refitted, and the original keycaps cleaned and realigned. Everett was adjusting a tension mechanism on the right side of the escapement, working with both hands in a space that didn't leave room for error. After a moment he said, without looking up, "Can you hold this steady?" Quinn set her bag down. She came to the bench and put both hands where he indicated, her left thumb against the side of the housing, her right, the mechanism himself, holding the tension, while he worked the bracket into place. They stayed like that for several minutes, her hands where he needed them, his working precisely around hers, the workshop quiet except for the small clicks of metal finding its position. When he was done, he said, "Thank you." Quinn didn't pick her bag up right away. 3 weeks in, Everett was in the workshop past midnight when the quiet got loud in the particular way it does when there is no one else in the building. Not silence. Old buildings don't go silent, but the specific quality of empty that you can feel. He sat on the stool at the workbench with his elbows on the wood and looked at the typewriter. On the shelf above the parts trays, pushed back between a parts manual and a jar of clock mainsprings, there was a photograph in a frame that had once been on a windowsill and had never quite made it back there. It was from 2011, taken in the restored reading room of a library in New Brunswick. A woman in a gray sweater, hair back, squinting slightly against the light through the tall windows. Her name was Anna. She had driven up from Fredericton the day the collection was installed and stood in the middle of the reading room, her hands in her back pockets, and looked at the 12 fully restored typewriters arranged on the display tables and said, simply, "You did something here." She had been the one to tell him to come home to Kelowna. The diagnosis was November 2015. He'd been 6 weeks into a restoration contract for a private library collection in Toronto that was supposed to run through spring. She had called on a Monday and said, not unkindly, not with anything that sounded like fear, "I don't need you to finish the contract. I need you here." He drove home that night. She died in August 2017. He stayed. Petra was 9. He opened the workshop and kept working. He picked up his phone from the bench, 11:15. There was a message from Quinn asking about the conditioned certificate process, whether he'd received the adjunct paperwork from the Dawson file. A routine question. Could have waited until morning. He wrote back that he had the paperwork and that the restoration was on schedule. He looked at the message for a moment before sending. Nobody had asked him about the schedule. 4 minutes later, she wrote back, "I know." He set the phone face down on the bench. On the afternoon of week 5, August arrived with a folded piece of paper he set on the workbench without explanation. Everett unfolded it. It was a photocopy of a page from a 1959 issue of the Mechanical Arts Review, a trade publication out of Montreal that had run for 11 years before folding. The article was a technical feature on the private commission programs that had operated in Canada in the post-war period. The consortium's work ran to a page and a half. No photographs of individual machines, no names, but the technical specifications, the escapement mounting, the carriage design, the typeface configuration, were described in enough detail that anyone with the right background would have no difficulty understanding exactly which machines were being discussed. August picked up his tea. "I didn't bring that," he said. He left. Everett read the article twice. Then he smoothed it flat on the bench and set a block of wood on top of it so it wouldn't slide. This was the piece he'd been missing. Not the proof, but the connective tissue. If he could link the serial code to the technical specifications in this article and have an independent assessor formalize the connections, the provenance argument would hold at auction. He looked at his phone. Quinn's name on the screen, still from the night before. He didn't call. He didn't put the phone away either. 41 days in, Quinn arrived at her desk to find an email that had come in just after midnight. No sender display name, no subject line, a single attachment, a scanned document, 11 pages. The header read Whitmore Commission. Private Registry of 7, restricted use, dated April 1961. She read it carefully. 6 machines listed with full serial sequences. The 7th entry was marked with an asterisk and a handwritten marginal note, disposition unconfirmed post 1962. Against the 7th entry, a 4-character sequence at the start of the serial number that she had seen before. She forwarded it to Dawson's tech administrator and asked for the sending address to be traced. The response came back before noon. A public terminal at the Kelowna Public Library, Rutland branch. She sat with that for a while. Then she pulled the original lot file and found the name she was looking for. The Whitmore Commission had been administered through the National Arts and Industry Board. The listed conservator for the program, cross-referenced through a footnote in the article August had left, was a name she looked up, Dr. Harlan Brew, Chief Mechanical Conservator, retired 1987, deceased 2003. But the registry document had been assembled and annotated by someone else. The notation style in the margins matched the handwriting in the binder she had seen on the workbench during her 3rd visit. She drove to the workshop. Everett was at the bench when she came in. She set her laptop on the cleared corner and opened it and turned the screen toward him without saying anything. He looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked up at her. "You need verification," he said. "I need to understand what I'm looking at." "You're looking at why I bid on it," he told her. Not everything, not in the order it had happened, but the shape of it. 12 years of restoration work, the consortium research he'd started. After a passing reference in a collector newsletter in 2009, the 6 weeks he'd spent building a PARP registry from fragments. He told her about leaving Toronto in 2015 and why. He said Anna's name once plainly, in the tone of a man who has learned to say it without building anything around it. Quinn listened. She was good at listening, had built an entire professional practice around hearing what was said and what was underneath it. She heard both. When he finished, she looked at the typewriter. The housing was closed now, the keys correct, the exterior clean to its original condition. She hadn't known what a fully restored version of this machine would look like, and she found that what she'd been imagining had been wrong. Under the workshop light, the black lacquer was deep and even, and the chrome fittings caught the ceiling, light precisely, and the whole object had the quality of something that had been waiting patiently for someone to know what it was. "What are you going to do with it when you're done?" she asked. "Return it to where it belongs." She wasn't sure if he meant the market or something larger. She didn't ask. When she left, she paused outside in the cold for a moment before getting in her car. The workshop light was warm in the window. She could hear him moving around in there, the sound of tools, footsteps on the wood floor. She stood in the parking space on Bernard Avenue in the early dark of a December afternoon and was aware that she was paying attention, genuinely, without calculating the angle of it. The way she'd used to pay attention to things before she'd learned to turn it into an assessment. She drove home and didn't know exactly what to do with that. On the evening of day 42, the typewriter was finished. Everett stood at the far end of the bench with his arms folded and looked at it. The keys were aligned correctly. The carriage moved with a resistance that was exactly right, smooth without being loose. The external case, cleaned and reconditioned, showed its age honestly without showing its damage. The original ribbon had been replaced with the correct specification. The machine looked like what it was, a working object made by someone who cared how it worked. August was there. He'd arrived with soup in a thermos and hadn't left. He sat on the stool by the window looking at the typewriter with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years around significant objects and had learned not to mistake his own response for objectivity. "Will you disclose the provenance at the sale?" he asked. "If Quinn can formalize it through Dawson, yes. If she can't, I list it as a documented restoration and walk away with enough to fix the windshield. You didn't do this for the money." "No." Everett looked at his watch. "But Petra needs a new winter jacket, and the furnace has been making a sound." August laughed, a real laugh, without any polish on it. At 9 that evening, Quinn called. She had spent the better part of the week working through it. The anonymous document, the trade publication article, an independent assessment she'd arranged, with a conservator from a respected institution in Edmonton who had agreed to review the physical object and the documentation. She had a provenance file that was not airtight, but was legitimate, claimed heritage from a known post-war Canadian commission, supported by physical examination and partial documentation, disclosed fully per Dawson's buyer transparency protocol. Everett listened. Then he said, "Is Philip Crest going to be a problem for you?" A pause. The first time he had asked her something about her rather than the typewriter. "Probably," she said. "That's mine to deal with," she added, a moment later. An hour after the call, there was a knock at the workshop door. Everett opened it and found Philip Crest standing on the step, in a wool coat. The kind of man who dressed well, even when he was doing something he was aware he probably shouldn't. He looked past Everett at the typewriter on the bench. His face moved through several calculations in quick succession. The last thing to settle was want. Clean and uncomplicated want. He offered $60,000 on the spot. Cash equivalent tonight, private transaction. No auction fees, no waiting. Everett shook his head. Philip raised the number. He made a logical case for it, citing the uncertainty of auction outcomes, the benefit of a guaranteed transaction, the time savings. He was measured and persuasive and had clearly done this before. Everett said, "You had 6 weeks to ask. I spent 6 weeks to build my answer." He stepped back and closed the door. He stood in the workshop alone for a moment. Then, from the direction of the old love seat in the corner, the one he'd dragged in from the upstairs 3 years ago, when overnight jobs became regular, came a quiet voice. "Dad." Petra was sitting up, a blanket across her lap, looking at him with the slightly unfocused expression of someone who had been half asleep and come partway back. Was someone here? Just someone who came to see the typewriter. She looked at the typewriter on the bench. She hadn't seen it finished, had come by twice during the restoration, but always with it in pieces. "It looks old," she said. "It is old." She considered it with her particular brand of 13-year-old gravity. "But it looks like it works. It does work." She looked at it for another moment. "Good," she said, and leaned back and was asleep again almost immediately. Everett stayed where he was for a while. Then he crossed the room and put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, and then straightened and stood there, in the quiet workshop, with the typewriter on the bench, and the lamp still on, and let the moment be what it was. The Dawson estate auction on the following Thursday was fuller than it had been in recent memory. Not every chair taken, but close. There were buyers from Vancouver and Calgary, and one registered bidder who had driven up from Seattle. Collectors moved through the preview hour speaking to each other in the careful, lateral way that people do when they are trying to assess what they are looking at without revealing what they think. Quinn had listed the typewriter 10 days earlier with a full write-up. Claimed prototype, provenance from the 1953 Canadian Typographic Design Consortium Private Commission Program, unverified by original institutional authority, supported by independent mechanical assessment and partial documentary evidence, disclosed per Dawson's standard buyer transparency protocol. She had included high-resolution photographs, the assessment report, the article from the Mechanical Arts Review, and a notation on the serial sequence correlation. It was more documentation than any lot in the Dawson inventory had ever carried. Philip Crest had not registered to bid. He had sent someone instead, a woman in a navy blazer who sat in the third row and didn't speak to anyone. The typewriter came to the table at 11:20. The room went quiet. Not the functional quiet between lots, but the particular quality of quiet that arrives when a room collectively decides that the object in front of it deserves attention. Quinn set the opening at $4,500. 5 paddles went up. Within 3 minutes the room was at $62,000 and narrowing. By 6 minutes it was the woman in the navy blazer and a buyer from Calgary who had identified himself at registration as a private collector. They went back and forth with the focused attention of two people who had both decided to win. 90,000, 95, 110, 120. The woman raised her paddle, paused at 120,000. Quinn found Everett near the back wall, same position as 6 weeks ago, jacket pocket, watching the typewriter. He had consigned it to Dawson 4 days before the auction and stepped out of the process. He was just watching. The Calgary buyer raised his paddle, 130,000. The woman in the navy blazer looked at her paddle. She looked at the typewriter. She set the paddle on her knee, Quinn gave the room 10 seconds. $130,000. Going once. She paused. Going twice. The room was completely still. She brought the gavel down. The room broke into applause. A few people first and then the rest. Philip Crest's representative stood up and left without making eye contact with anyone. People watched her go. Quinn signed the sale sheet and looked up. Everett was looking at her from across the room. Not smiling. Just looking, with the particular steadiness of a person who has said what they needed to say by means other than words. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the paperwork, aware that something had shifted in the room, or perhaps in her own reading of it, and unsure precisely when it had happened. The crowd thinned over the following 40 minutes. Everett signed the settlement at the side table. After Dawson's commission and administrative fees, a number settled into the account that had been running on careful arithmetic for 2 years. He stood in the hallway and looked at the figure on the form and let out a slow breath. It wasn't the number, it was the confirmation that what he had seen in a bad photograph at his kitchen table 6 weeks ago had been real, that the reading had been right, that the work had been worth the doing. Philip Crest came down the hallway and stopped in front of him. He didn't have the edge he'd carried in every prior interaction. He had the look of a man doing an honest calculation and arriving at a result he hadn't planned for. "You knew what it was from the catalog," he said. "Yes." Philip looked at him with something that wasn't quite respect but was the thing that comes just before it, when the acknowledgement is involuntary. "I looked at the same catalog," he said. "Same photograph." A pause. "I saw a damaged typewriter in poor condition." Everett didn't say anything. Philip nodded once, slowly. Then he walked on. Quinn found him near the side door a few minutes later. "You didn't tell me about the Whitmore registry when I first asked about the typewriter," she said. "You didn't ask. I searched your name after the first visit." "I know." She stopped. "When did you know?" He said it plainly. "When you came to the workshop the second time. You asked about the escapement mounting configuration." "That's not a question someone asks, unless they've read the technical literature." She looked at him with the expression of a person who is accustomed to being the one who has done the reading, encountering someone who noticed. She didn't have a ready answer. That was unusual for her. The main door opened and Petra came in with Mrs. Osei right behind her, still in her coat from the drive over. Petra moved directly toward her father in the particular way of someone who has a question they've been holding for an hour. "How much?" she asked. "Enough for the jacket, and the furnace, and possibly a new sign for the workshop." Petra assessed this with the gravity it deserved. Then she looked at Quinn. The frank, direct appraisal of a 13-year-old with no incentive to soften anything. "You're the one who ran the auction," she said. "I held the gavel," Quinn said. Petra thought about this seriously. "That's the important part," she said. Everett looked at Quinn, and for the first time, without reservation, he smiled. 2 weeks later, there was a different object on the bench in the Bernard Avenue workshop, a 1940s survey theodolite, with a seized horizontal circle that a retired geologist in Penticton had brought in and asked whether it could be made to work again. Bread and butter work. Everett was at the bench when August's car pulled into the lot. August came in and sat on the stool without being invited, which was the only way he ever occupied a space. "The Whitmore estate reached out," he said, "through the family solicitor. They traced the auction through Dawson's public records. They're not contesting the sale, chain of title is clean, nothing to claim. But they want to talk. There may be interest in having someone involved in the documentation process for the remaining 2 missing machines. Consultant basis, or more depending." Everett looked at the theodolite for a moment. Then he said, "What did you tell them?" "That I'd pass it along." August was quiet after that. He had a talent for leaving room in a conversation, learned over 4 decades of working with people who thought more clearly when they weren't being pushed. Everett was still sitting with it when he heard a car he didn't recognize turn into the lot. He heard the door, and then footsteps on the gravel, and then on the wood of the front step. The knock was quick, 2 taps, the knock of someone who isn't sure they're expected. Quinn came in. She had nothing with her. No bag, no clipboard, nothing professional in her hands at all. She stood in the middle of the workshop in her coat and looked at Everett at the bench. "The Whitmore solicitor called Dawson's office this morning," she said, "to verify the provenance documentation for their records. I heard. August just told me. They asked me if I knew someone who might be the right person for the documentation work. She paused. They asked whoever knew your work best right now. A silence, brief and settled. I'm not sure why I answered, she said. The workshop was quiet in the way it had been on the night he'd sat alone with the typewriter. But it was a different quality of quiet now. Not the quiet of one person in a space, but the quiet of two people in the same place arriving at the same understanding, close enough together that the arrival felt shared. Do you want to see what came in? Everett said. It was not a complicated question. It was the question of someone who wanted a reason for another person to stay. Quinn looked at the theodolite on the bench. What is it? Survey instrument, 1940s. The horizontal circle has seized. Can you fix it? He looked at it. I think so. She came to the bench. He shifted to make room. She looked at the instrument the way she'd learned to look at things over the past 6 weeks. Not for price, not for category, but for what it actually was. She said. He did. The door to Bernard Avenue stayed open. The December light came through at a flat angle, the way winter light does in the Okanagan, and laid 2 shadows across the workshop floor, longer than the people casting them. Neither of them had been looking for this. But that, it turned out, was the thing that made it possible.